Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. This is a story in 3 parts, really. The first part is political story, and that's the longest aspect, because it took the longest period of time. And then there's a story, the bridge building story, and then third is the bridge as a cultural icon that it has become today, really a symbol of Newport. So we start at the end of the story, and that's opening day. Opening days of suspension bridges are special occasions. The Brooklyn Bridge, Roebling's masterpiece, opened with celebrations that lasted all day and night on May 24th, 1883. Golden Gate festivities carried on for a week with a pedestrian bridge on May 27, 1937, when 200 people walked across the bridge. And even the Queen came out for the opening of the Fourth Road Bridge, Lincoln, Edinburgh, and St. Andrews, in September of 1964. The Newport Bridge opened Saturday, June 28, 1969, and had the feeling of one of Newport's favorite diversions, a debutante ball. Complete with formal invitations from Governor Frank Leach and Rhode Island Turnpike and Bridge Authority Chairman Francis Jerry Dwyer, who served as master of ceremonies. Dwyer declared that Newport's future was assured. We did it, by gosh we did it, Dwyer said, echoing his favorite musical, My Fair Lady. John H. Chafee, then Secretary of the Navy, said his only request was that they built it so you could see over the water when you crossed. Every other bridge gets it so you can't see anything. I'm sure I'm on the same page. Governor Frank Leach was the main speaker. He had defeated Chafee in the elections of 1968, and on this day, Chafee was serving as the Secretary of State of the United States. Governor Frank Leach hit all the major themes of the bridge story. It marked the beginning of a new era. It fulfilled the dream of generations of Rhode Islanders. It was a tribute to those who conceived the idea, fought for its acceptance, and planned and built the bridge. The new bridge was an avenue of progress that provides a boost to Rhode Island's overall expansion, and it was a monument to perseverance. The opening day ceremonies also signaled the demise of the 300-year-old ferry. Passengers aboard the last revenue-generating trip were torn between progress and romanticism. That whistle couldn't be sadder, said Joe Sheehan of Newport, one of the last riders, while Mrs. Howland Hammond of Jamestown could care less for that monstrosity of a bridge over there. Newport itself is a desirable place, but hard to describe. It's full of contrasts and contradictions. In 1906, Henry James claimed there was nothing less possible than to describe Newport. It was America's first modern town, tolerant, enlightened, cosmopolitan, right-sized, contained. In 1854, Harper's Magazine declared that in Newport, a man can farm with one hand and fish with another. Newport became America's first resort in both senses of the word, chronological and premier. But getting to Newport has always been difficult. Narragansett Bay consumes the southeastern half of the state. Native Americans and early colonists used the bay as a highway. At age 69, Roger Williams canoed 20 miles from Providence to Newport to debate the merits of Quakerism with its leader, George Fox. A ferry system began as early as 1675, maybe earlier. Steamships started making regular stops in Newport in 1847. A railroad line was extended to Newport down the East Bay after the Civil War, and the splendid show palaces of the Fall River Line ended service in 1937, partially because of the rise of automobility. The irony of the bay is that it facilitated early waterborne traffic, but hindered land transportation. After World War II, Newport was reinventing itself from a sailor town to a tourist center. through historic preservation, urban renewal, and city planning. William Lees, who headed Newport's post-war redevelopment activities, recounts the line from a consultant surveying the Newport scene. What you have here is Fall River with a view. Almost 10% of Newport's housing was either dilapidated or lacked adequate plumbing. The character of Newport was changing with increased suburbanization. Businesses were moving from downtown to suburban shopping plazas. Highways and streets needed improving. The city struggled to accommodate the crush of automobiles. Parking was insufficient. Newport developed a comprehensive plan in 1962 with the goal of retaining its historic charm while accommodating post-war expansion. And it now had the tool to implement its plan, urban renewal. Early momentum for the bridge, initial stirrings, began around 1935 when the Jamestown Bridge was being contemplated. Senator Theodore Francis Green requested a crossing to Newport with a landing at Gould Island, well north of naval operations. But World War II interrupted plans for a Jamestown to Newport span. As post-war wound down, Green proposed an East Passage Bridge as a post-war construction project. The Navy objected, warning that even the least objectionable location would interfere with national defense and naval operations. Then, in August 8, 1945, Governor J. Howard McGrath and a delegation of Rhode Islanders met with Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, and the Navy withdrew its opposition. The Newport-Jamestown Bridge Commission released plans for a two-section bridge from Jamestown to Gould Island and then from Gould Island to Cottington Cove, was very reminiscent of the old Jamestown Bridge, which you can see on the top of that slide right there. The following month, President Truman tapped bridge advocate McGrath to the U.S. Solicitor General, and in December of 1945, Forrestal informed Senator Green that the Navy had not approved the bridge or its location after all, saying that the Navy might consider a Dumplings to Newport Neck crossing. Nothing much happened until 1947. There was little progress, and Representative from Newport, Charles Walsh, introduced a bill to establish the Narragansett Bay Bridge Authority. It died in session. Proponents formed a civic group called the Newport-Jamestown Bridge Association, formed in the fall of that year to get the ball rolling for a bridge, promising not to stop until one was under construction. In January 1948, at his annual address, Governor John O. Pastore, who had replaced McGrath, proposed the state build bridges in Providence and Newport. Walsh immediately reintroduced his bill, and Newport State Senator John Fitzgerald filed a companion bill. Fiery debates ensued in the House Corporations Committee. Faced with losing control of their bridges and ferries, Jamestown politicians, led by Alton Head Jr., opposed the bill, arguing that responsibility for the new bridge should rest in existing organizations, meaning Jamestown Bridge Commission or the Jamestown Ferry Company. Fitzgerald claimed Head had prevented construction on the bridge for the past 7 years. He warned that one man cannot obstruct forward progress. Over 200 citizens, mostly proponents, attended the contentious February 1948 Corporations Committee meeting in Providence. Newport State Rep. Harvey and bridge booster John Lyons led the way by laying out the economic arguments for the bridge. The bridge would fuel economic benefits for the whole state and region. The ferries were losing between $500,000 and $1 million a year. Driving through Providence was inefficient, and they had petitions favoring the bridge with 2,000 signatures from Newport and 500 from Jamestown to bolster their case. The opponents' position was simple: hold out for a better bill. They did not oppose the bridge, and this was a talking point for many years, just the way to pay for it. They objected to unknown out-of-state bankers who were attempting to hijack the Jamestown Bridge toll revenues, and they said the proposed bridge could not pay for itself with toll revenues. The Democratic House passed Walsh's bill. The Republican Senate could not agree on a compromise bill between it and an alternative bill submitted by M. James Vieira on behalf of the Jamestown Town Council. It seemed unlikely that either bill would survive a concurrent vote and be enacted, but that is what happened in April 1948, creating the Narragansett Bay Bridge Authority, which soon presented two plans to the Navy Department. Plan A, a $20 million bridge from Taylor Point in Jamestown to Coasters Harbor Island. Plan B, a $25 million bridge from Eldridge Ave to Gould Island, then to Codington Cove, tangling with Navy installations every step of the way. In March, the Army Corps of Engineers held a hearing in Providence. Once again, bridge proponents descended on the State House in droves, overwhelmingly advocating for Plan A. Navy Rear Admiral Ross Cooley objected and requested alternate site proposals. Vieira, now general manager of the Narragansett Bay Bridge Authority, produced one in 2 days from Taylor Point, running just north of Rose Island, to Van Zandt, costing $28 million. They dismissed the Dumplings Fort Adams crossing desired by the Navy, a 600-foot-high, 2,000-foot span suspension bridge with estimates ranging from 40 to 50 million. Curiously, Cooley found that to be the least objectionable, even though it would be difficult to reach, touch desired areas of both islands, and possibly take a few holes from Newport Country Club. As you can see in the map on the right side of here. The Commission relented, and the Navy approved a 7,700-foot suspension bridge between the Dumplings and Fort Adams. Miraculously, the price came in at $32 million. The authority applied for $965,000 from the General Services Administration to develop plans. That was 10 times higher than the total amount earmarked for the state of Rhode Island for such purposes, which was denied because the bridge would not contribute directly to national defense. The Korean War was raging. The GSA and the Navy would have to take a strong hand in favor of the bridge, and that was not going to happen. The authority ran out of steam, unable to muster even a quorum for its 1952 annual meeting. They held a last session in July 1953, urging members to attend a meeting later that month of the Tri-State Southern New England Thruway from New Haven to Provincetown. This is, you can see it in red there. Also pay attention to Route 138 in that, where it goes right around URI, two potential forks in the road that plays a role later on. The General Assembly passed enacting legislation for the Rhode Island Turnpike and Bridge Authority in May 1954. Governor Dennis Roberts signed it into law. We went through governors very quickly. The authority could not use public funds to build the bridge, and once built, it must be self-sufficient. Toll revenues from the Jamestown Bridge would fund its construction. Thereafter, the Newport Bridge toll revenues would pay back the bonds issued to build the bridge. The Jamestown Ferry franchise would be transferred to the Rhode Island Turnpike and Bridge Authority, for which the town of Jamestown would receive $250,000. The authority was not intended to be evergreen. It was to dissolve itself when the bonds were paid off and its properties transferred to the state. It had 5 years to issue the bonds, otherwise its remit would expire. The Navy reiterated it would not approve any bridge or tunnel that reaches property along the Newport shore. Now, the Navy liked the tunnel. From Jamestown to Prudence Island, thence from Prudence Island to Portsmouth. In February 1955, the authority's engineers proposed a tunnel from Jamestown's Table Point to Newport's Coasters Island, basically the path of the current bridge. It would cost $36.8 million to build. But traffic studies could only support 2/3 of that amount. In addition, the engineers insisted that the highway from the Connecticut border to Jamestown must be improved with a hefty price tag of $23.4 million. Tunnel plans were shelved. The 5-year clock was ticking on the authority when it received a lifeline extension from the General Assembly. A proposed bridge from Warwick to Barrington was in the works. Then in June 1959, 3 New York banking groups expressed interest in the project. In a fortuitous stroke of luck, Governor Christopher Del Sesto appointed Jerry Dwyer as chairman of the authority. Dwyer was fascinated with bridges. His father's business was a few doors away from Herbert W. Smith, acknowledged leader of the Mount Hope Bridge. Dwyer had run for lieutenant governor on the same ticket as Del Sesto and lost to John Noddy, yet another governor, in a few minutes. Dwyer released a $35.4 million bridge plan in January 1960. He followed with legislation to remove the self-sustaining clause, acquire the two other bridges, Mount Hope and Jamestown, and have the state guarantee $20 million of the bonds. Dwyer also called the traffic studies ridiculously low. So now they wanted $20 million, the removal of the state to guarantee $20 million of bonds, and that had to go to the legislation, and it also had to go to the state voters. Rhode Island Senate Finance Committee set a hearing at the end of March, and another caravan of proponents descended on the State House. This time the Navy supported the project. Opposition resurfaced from Jamestown, led by Town Council Chair Francis Costa. Jamestowners hated the tolls, and their bridge was going to be toll-free within a few years. Costa called the scheme a rape of their community. The following month, Rhode Island Senate passed the bill 34-0. Without much enthusiasm, Del Sesto moved the bill forward to a statewide referendum. The Providence Journal, you'll hear a lot about the Providence Journal editorial board. Back then in the 1960s, there was the circulation of the newspapers was significant to be 112% of the households. Everybody read the newspaper, and the newspapers had significant influence. If you read the articles in the journal, it was straight reporting, who, what, where, when. It wasn't tainted with opinions. That was left to the editorial board. In this case, the journal voiced opposition, saying those road projects, the state road projects, and the bridge could not be supported solely by its own tolls. 95 had yet to be completed through Rhode Island at that time. Meanwhile, the scene shifted to Washington, D.C. in June 1960 for a hearing with the U.S. Subcommittee of Public Roads. The bill under consideration by the U.S. Senate would authorize the authority to absorb the Jamestown Bridge and extend tolls after the bonds were paid off. The law was needed because the bridge had been built with federal funds. Dwyer opened by stating without the bridge, southern Rhode Island would suffer economic stagnation. Once the new bridge was built, Jamestown residents would cross the Jamestown Bridge toll-free. They would eliminate those tolls. The Rhode Island General Assembly passed the bill with one dissenting vote, during which the people of Jamestown received a fair hearing, Dwyer told the U.S. Senate Subcommittee. Besides, the population of Jamestown was 2,600 people, compared to the 100,000 statewide folks that were for the bridge. Jamestown Town Council President Costa led the opponents. Jamestown economy was depressed, he said. The people had already carried an arduous burden of tolls. Continuing them would be unjust. Passing the bills would be a breach of contract by the U.S. government, who years prior approved the Jamestown Bridge. Andrew Quinn, attorney for the Jamestown Bridge Commission, implored the subcommittee not to ruin this little bit of a town. It was the people of Newport versus the people of Jamestown, and Quinn added, Newport was no big attraction. Pastore characterized the issue as a highly excitable controversy. It passed Congress later that summer, and President Eisenhower signed it into law. In November, however, facing opposition from the Journal editorial board and a complicated ballot, the voters of Rhode Island rejected the bridge in the statewide referendum, 58% to 42%. Bridge opponents immediately called for Dwyer's head. His former adversary, John Noddy, had knocked off Del Sesto for governor. Dwyer went on the offensive, wanting to issue $4 million in bonds to purchase the Jamestown and Mount Hope bridges. The opinion makers called it an unpleasant note of arrogance and called for the authorities' elimination. Bills were introduced in the General Assembly but failed. Meanwhile, plans to move forward with assuming control of the Jamestown Bridge and Mount Hope Bridge were hung up in legal quagmire in the Rhode Island Supreme and Superior Courts. That changed on November 6, 1962, the day John Chafee defeated John Nunn for governor by 398 votes. Jerry Dwyer was Chafee's statewide campaign manager. Chafee made his position clear in his inaugural speech. He was for the bridge, always had been. Regardless, opponents continued to try to put the authority out of business. The bridge had become a life-or-death proposition for Newport. Without it, proponents claimed the city would wither on the vine. In March, the authority submitted legislation to assume control of the Jamestown and Mount Hope bridges. Again, the Jamestown Bridge would be toll-free. Once the bonds were paid, the Mount Hope's tolls would fund the new bridge. Chafee supported the bill, promising speedy action. The Providence Journal voiced their editorial opposition once again, saying that the bridge should not be built if it could not sustain itself. The bill passed in April and Chafee signed it into law in May. In November 1963, Dwyer began pushing for the bridge through bureaucratic channels, including the Rhode Island Division of Harbors and Rivers and the Army Corps of Engineers. At the bond issuer's request, Chafee asked the Rhode Island Supreme Court for an advisory opinion on questions concerning financing. The results were not favorable. The Supreme Court ruled a number of the bill's provisions unconstitutional and required statewide voter approval to move forward. The opinion did not bar the authority from assuming control of the Mount Hope Bridge, so they did that in June 1964. Dwyer and Chafee now eagerly awaited the updated traffic study, which was imminent. If favorable, Chafee said, construction on the proposed bridge would begin right away. The last remaining hurdle was the upcoming November election, when statewide voters would be asked again to guarantee the bonds. Dwyer and Chafee promoted a yes vote on the referendum throughout the state. On September 23, 1964, Chafee and Dwyer released a game-changing traffic report. It confirmed what Dwyer had long maintained. Previous studies were conservative. The bridge tolls, along with the Mount Hope revenue, could pay for the new structure. The bridge was now estimated at $45.4 million, and it would cross from Taylor Point to Washington Street. The bridge referendum passed, receiving 63% of the votes, and Chafee was easily reelected. 2 days after the financing victory, Dwyer tossed in a monkey wrench. He asked the Navy to consider a more northern route from Eldridge Avenue to Browns Lane in Middletown. Browns Lane is where Wanamatommy Golf Course is and St. Columba's Cemetery. Chaos followed. Everyone had an opinion. Some Newporters were upset that the terminus might be shifted out of the city. Others were upset it might stay. The Newport Preservation Society was for the northern route. So were 14 Newport citizens whose petition labeled the Taylor Point Washington Street crossing an irremediable mistake. The Newport Bridge Committee, a citizens group, favored a Washington Street terminus, and they had 2,500 signatures of people who agreed with them. The authority discovered the northern path would cost $9.6 million more than the approved route and began backpedaling. In December, Dwyer told the Navy they were sticking with the southern route. Chafee spent most of that winter tapping down bridge location flare-ups with his constituents, including influential preservationist Antoinette Downing and Ambassador Wiley Buchanan. By 1965, Newport's economy was improving. Thanks to the American Cup races and music festivals, tourism and recreation contributed 750,000 visitors in the summer of 1964. In January, Chafee asked the Supreme Court for another advisory opinion on whether the authority could use tolls from the Mount Hope Bridge to build the Newport Bridge. A year earlier, the Supreme Court hinted that voters must approve it, but since it was not specifically asked to opine on that question at that time, they did not render an opinion. It was a grave oversight by the proponents. The authority closed its Newport office. James Cannon, who the authority hired the previous November as general manager, and Joseph Savage and their secretaries were transferred to the authority's Mount Hope Bridge Division. Opposition to the referendum emanated from Bristol and Portsmouth, but Dwyer dismissed that, saying only 78 residents used the bridge to commute to work. The opinion makers supported the bill thanks to the revised traffic report. Less than 10% of the eligible voters of the state turned out in June 1965 to opine on 5 spending measures. But 45% of Newporters voted, and 90% of those were for the bridge. The yes votes carried 3-1. Newport Mayor Charles Andy Hambley, overcome with exuberance, called it the greatest thing that has happened to Newport since its founding in 1639. The bridge would now be built, and it would be called the Newport Bridge. Upstate lawmakers tried to name it the Verrazano Bridge 2 weeks earlier, but that resolution lost by 2 votes. In August 1965, the authority opened the first bids of the bridge substructure, and they were 25% higher than anticipated. The first phase would consume the entire $3.5 million set aside for contingencies. Dwyer projected comments, saying it was not unexpected. Chafee, however, was much more concerned. He summoned Dwyer, Public Works Director Marcello, bondman Bob Christie, and Alfred Hedefine, head engineer, to his office on September 1st, 1965. Chafee worked through the numbers and did not like the results. The cost of the bridge was jumping from $42.5 to $47.5 million, and work had yet to start. The team shaved off $3 million, half of that by going to the treme pour method, which is an underwater way to pour cement. It became evident that the state would need to front $650,000 for 3 years, about $2 million, to pay the interest on the bonds guaranteed. Chafee hand-wrote the amortization schedule on a sheet of paper and insisted that the authority would pay back the money to the state. Chafee put the bond payments in his budget. That's when the real fireworks started in April 1966. When Socket Senator Francis Smith, Democratic chairman of the State Finance Committee, decided that the state would not pay the interest expense. Dwyer said that the authority would not pay it either. He needed the money to build the bridge, and besides, the terms and conditions of the bonds would not allow it. Dwyer said the action by the Finance Committee would put the state in default, and on April 21st, his prediction came to fruition. The state's credit rating crashed. The state attempted to float $18 million bond to speed highway construction, Route 95, and had no takers, not one. State Treasurer Hawksley tried to pin the fiasco on Dwyer. Democratic Representative Michael Seppi from Cranston called for Dwyer's resignation. Chafee demonstrated superior leadership. First, he reassured the public that the interest expense would be paid. Second, he summoned the parties to his office the first thing the following Monday morning. For once, the editorial writers backed Dwyer, calling the chaos a shadow on the credit of the state and saying that Smith and his fellow Democrats have thrashed around like bulls in a china shop. On Monday, Chafee led the meeting in which the participants hammered out a 5-point plan, including payment of the interest expense and asking the voters to approve another $7 million. Dwyer proclaimed that was all they would need. The bridge was headed for another referendum. As construction began over the east passage of Narragansett Bay in January 1966, another political storm was brewing. The authority had granted a $6.5 million no-bid contract to Perini Construction, which had previously been awarded the main superstructure, the main substructure bid, and already had the concrete-making equipment in the middle of Narragansett Bay. This contract was for the remaining piers, and the authority figured that Perini's price was reasonable. Warwick Mayor Horace Hobbs was running against Chafee, called for the governor to issue a restraining order because the no-bid contract violated state procedure. Authority members voted 3-2 against rescinding the contract. The Democratic leaders in the General Assembly reacted by establishing a committee to investigate the matter, which unanimously declared the authority of any wrongdoing. All of this was happening just 45 days before the upcoming referendum to gain approval for the additional $7 million. It passed anyway, 61 to 39%, and Chafee drubbed Hobbs 63 to 37%. 1 year into construction, in January 1967, Parsons Brinckerhoff produced an 11-page, single-spaced report titled The Rising Costs of the Newport Bridge. In the fall of '64, the cost of the bridge was projected at $39 million. By January 1967, it had jumped to $54 million, close to $60 million, when temporary interest and financing costs were included. It was an industry-wide problem. Construction costs were rising, and jobs across the country, anywhere from 16 to 231%. For example, a New York subway project between Manhattan and Queens was up 159%, and the World Trade Center was well over twice its original estimate. Part of the blame for the rising costs was the Vietnam War, which had elevated the demand for material and human resources. In March 1967, Dwyer announced the authority needed $6.5 million more. The bridge faced a 5th referendum. Chafee said he was badly let down by the engineers. Anyone can tell you the cost will be a month from now, he said. Their job was to tell us what it would cost during the construction. Parsons and Brinckerhoff, the engineering firm, fell on his sword. The new bridge would cost $61 million, and on June 29, 1967, the 5th and final referendum passed 60 to 40, rather than ending up with one high diving board. Parsons and Brinckerhoff's Albert Hedison was a steady and reliable partner for 30 years. His firm proposed one proposal after another. The Newport Bridge was his crowning achievement, for which he received numerous awards. Like all suspension bridges, it included several design construction innovations. Foremost among these, it was the first bridge, major suspension bridge, to use sharp fabricated parallel wire strands to comprise the main cables. New plastic covering to protect the main cables from corroding. New cable anchorage system using long pipe assemblies encased in each anchorage's concrete piers, and pile driving in water 162 feet deep. The engineers knew the physical features of Narragansett Bay. The engineers knew, in early 1964, they conducted a geological survey and boring program to determine the specifics of the bottom of the bay. To the west of the center line, the Jamestown side, bedrock sat at 100 feet below the water. To the east, it dropped to 430 feet in relative short order. The deep gorge was directly under the main towers of the bridge, 1,200 feet wide. The engineers needed a span of at least 1,600 feet, about the same length as the Brooklyn Bridge's span. The piers of the Newport Bridge are designated according to their position from the center span. Just use this for 1 second. Going towards Jamestown is 1W, 2W, 3W, etc. The Newport side is 1E, 2E, 3E, etc. The main towers are at 1W and 1E. Suspension bridges need cable bends, where the cables come down. These are at 2W and 2E. Anchorages, which hold the cables and hold the bridge up, are placed at 4 on the Newport Bridge, are placed at 4W and 4E. The engineers protected the bridge with a barrier of riprap around the foundations. To build a bridge capable of withstanding hurricanes, the engineers studied storm flow, replicating the hurricane of 1938, combined with the highest spring tide. The bridge is designed to sustain gusts of 170 miles an hour and temperatures ranging from 118 degrees to -2 degrees. The main characteristics of the superstructure is the distinctive Gothic arches of the main towers, channeling Roebling's Brooklyn Bridge. They rise 400 feet above the water, and the roadway hangs from the cables at 215 feet above the water. On December 28th, the bridge builders planted the first of 3 observation piers on the Jamestown side of the bridge. Next, they drove piles into Narragansett Bay's rock bottom to build the foundations. Pier 1E was built at a spot where the bay's flow was 100 feet deep, but the top of the rock below was at 330 feet. The engineers placed the footing on a stone stratum 205 feet below the water, required 512 friction piles 90 feet long that would have to be leveled by an underwater cutting process. Pier 1W was built on bedrock 220 feet below sea level. To support the footing, the engineers drove 326 piles, 326 60-foot piles, 162 feet into the bedrock. It was the deepest pile drive attempted to date. The bridge builders had to trim about 900 of these friction piles. Divers could only cut 2 per day, as they had to descend and ascend very slowly, or they'd get the bends. The pile cutting process was significantly improved when bridge builders adopted this Westinghouse saturation chamber and diving bell, which arrived the first week of October. It increased their ability to cut 15 piles per day. Divers essentially lived in the saturation unit topside and commuted in the bell to the base floor, maintaining constant pressure all the while. The bridge builders then maneuvered 68-foot by 138-foot forms weighing 400 tons onto the piles. They needed the twin-boom Avondale Senior floating hoist machine to do the job. They floated it up from New Orleans. Next, the engineers built the anchorages, which incorporated for the first time an integrated tube assembly process developed by Bethlehem Steel. The bridge builders used treme method of pouring concrete underwater. It was the deepest treme pour to date. So rather than traditional caissons like you read about in bridge building, this was cement being poured through a pipe underwater, and as it filled, it raised the pipe up. And that's what the treme is. The superstructure, the Newport Bridge's $18.9 million superstructure incorporated 3 major innovations, but the most talked about was the off-site construction of parallel wire strands for the main cables. This is the Brooklyn Bridge, famous photo from image from the Newport Bridge. That was the first time major suspension bridge project would not spend strands for the main cable on the site since John Roebling invented the method a century earlier. Continuous improvements had reduced cable spinning time, but it was not until the Newport Bridge that prefabricated parallel wire strands were used in a major project. It was an accomplishment worth crowing about, and the engineers who built bridges boasted loudly. Bethlehem Steel, under the direction of engineer Jackson L. Durkee, had been working on the process in the hopes of speeding suspension bridge building. They shocked the engineering community by bidding for the second Delaware Memorial Bridge, but that proposal was rejected. Parsons Brinkerhoff was aware of Bethlehem's progress and included the options in its package, built the bid package for the Newport Bridge. The authority embraced Bethlehem Steel's method. The prefabricating cable method saved $553,000, and the new plastic wrapping another $50,000. Bethlehem Steel began fabricating the wire in November 1966, placed them on reels, and delivered them to the job site. The bridge over Narragansett Bay's East Passage became the focus of engineering interests worldwide. In another section of the Potsdam facility, workers began fabricating the towers. Each tower had 2 legs, tapering slightly at the top. Fabricated trusses connected the legs. The trusses were made up of 9 tiers, so each bridge has 2 legs and then 9 tiers of, this is the top tier, which contains the top of the arch. The trusses, the bridge fabricators welded plates of steel into box-like sections, milled the ends, assembled the sections, and reamed holes for field bolting. The welding, instead of riveting, added to a clean appearance to the towers. The component parts were shipped by rail to Rhode Island, and assembly began in May 1967. The towers were constructed pier by pier. A floating derrick placed the first 3. The remaining 6 were hauled into place with creeper derricks. Each leg was topped with a 25-ton cable saddle. On July 17, 1967, Chaffee took a 2.5-hour tour of the bridge. When you get up close, you realize how big a concern it is, he observed. He remained hopeful and optimistic that the bridge would open in the fall of 1968, but the bridge was in danger of falling behind. Storms in April and May damaged construction materials for the foundations. In August, bridge workers went on strike for weeks over who would remove excess concrete from the wooden forms. By the end of October, the 400-foot Gothic towers were in place. The catwalks were being built in November. Then the weather came. Between December 22, 1967 through January 16, 1968, the bridge builders lost time on all but 2 working days. Newport was in the midst of its fiercest winter on record up to that time. In June 1968, the bridge makers started hanging suspended roadway across the main channel. They attached the sections to the suspenders dangling from the main cable. There were 37 sections. The last was raised on September 19th and was adorned with an American flag, the traditional final steel symbol of good luck. A small gathering of spectator boats saluted the milestone with horns and whistles. The remaining gap between Newport and Jamestown was finally closed. Chaffee praised the event as a landmark of great promise. 4 days later, an iconic photo op occurred. The USS Essex, who was housed in Newport, cruised under the bridge into its home port with room to spare. She made it. In June 1968, the International Association of Bridge, Structural, and Ornamental Iron Workers of Local 57 walked off the job. They ultimately got their pay hike to $5.42 an hour, but the month-long strike would delay the bridge 6 months. Dwyer called the strike the straw that broke the camel's back. They could not pour cement in cold weather. The bridge would not open in 1968. The Indians working on the Newport Bridge likely benefited from the pay raise. They were known for their work on skyscrapers and bridges, mostly Mohawks from Montreal. They were called boomers because they moved from town to town following construction jobs. They commuted to Newport on Monday, drove home to Montreal on Friday, partied all weekend, and returned in time for work. They worked 400 feet in the air by day and hung out together in the local bars on Long Wharf at night, where the sounds of live music and people dancing on wooden floors were broken by an occasional war cry. It's pleasant to contemplate that the high-wire Indians helped build a monument over the waterway that Roger Williams once traveled to visit and trade with his Native American friends. The cement pourers returned the following spring to lay the roadways. On May 2nd, the opening day was set. The bridge would open on June 28, 1968. The bridge was up and running, but controversies did not end. The access roads that Parsons, Brinckerhoff, and Governor Leach urged be built were slow to materialize. The Route 138 bypass would never be built, even though URI made campus plans under the assumption that it would. I don't know if anyone was paying attention to last year. The state of Rhode Island finally scrapped all plans to build that 138 bypass. The paint started flaking in October 1970. and lawsuits were not settled for another dozen years after 3 Rhode Island Supreme Court decisions. But as promised, the bridge had an immediate impact. 15,000 vehicles crossed the first day. Within 8 days, it handled 104,000 vehicles. Its first major event was the 1969 Jazz Festival, the weekend after it opened. Promoter George Wein tried to fuse jazz and rock. Youth crashed the gates and camped out across Newport. Wein later called it the worst 4 days of his life. Some of the same rock bands that performed at Woodstock a month later, including 10 years after and Sly and the Family Stone. The Jamestown Ferry Landing room and gift shop were demolished in March 1970. In the first year, the bridge generated $1.8 million in total revenue and $2 million the next. The 1 millionth vehicle crossed on April 29, 1970. In 1976, the tall ship visit and parade helped Newport reestablish itself as America's first resort. By the end of the decade, 3 million vehicles were crossing the bridge annually. The 1964 traffic study predicted that 1.4 million cars would cross in 1985. In actuality, the number was 5 million. 3.5, more than projected. Dwyer resolutely argued that such estimates were conservative and inaccurately inflated the payback schedules for the proposed bridge. He was right. On special anniversaries of the bridge, local journalists would visit Dwyer. He would tell the story of why he wanted the bridge, retelling that when he was discharged from the Marines in 1950, he drove from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, only to miss the last ferry. He got the story crossed over the decades, though. One year he recalled sleeping in his car till morning. Another, he had himself driving around through Newport. A good story either way. This is an interesting photograph. In the caption, it calls itself a remarkable photo because of the way it was taken. But it's remarkable for another reason. In 1882, summer of 1882, Washington Roebling spent the only time away from the Brooklyn Bridge in Newport at the Mayer Cottage. The Mayer Cottage is now Stella Maris. So this photo, which I actually didn't know at the time, is to me it's a John Hart photo. The original is in the collection at here at the Newport Historical Society, and it shows the bridge. It shows a bridge where Roebling once looked out at over there. Wonder if you ever thought this should be a bridge. The Newport Bridge has graced Narragansett Bay for close to half a century. Next year is its 50th anniversary. Suspension bridges are special to their communities. The Newport Bridge has become a symbol representing Newport, much like the Golden Gate Bridge symbolizes San Francisco. Its image is ever present to residents and visitors to Newport, Jamestown, and the state of Rhode Island. In 2001, Rhode Island selected the bay, the boat, and the bridge to grace the obverse of the state's quarter, outpointing popular state founder Roger Williams and renowned artist Gilbert Stuart. In 2006, Beatrice Trixie Watson initiated a publication called Balancing the Tides, a Newport Journal. It offered artists a forum for unpublished works, pondering what draws them to Newport County. A photo of Watson snapped of the Newport Bridge, rising out of the early morning fog off Rose Island, graces the cover of the very first issue. Main Tower 1E dramatically reaches over Narragansett Bay, seemingly impervious to the haze that shrouds its majestic arch. In the foreground, the untamed green brush juxtaposes nature with the technology of the bridge. One is not surprised to find the bridge gracing the cover of the journal. In fact, it is representative of most publications about Newport. There is usually the bridge. The fourth entry of balancing the tides is also bridge themed. It's titled Views from the Bridge by Jeanette Rodriguez. It began by posing a question frequent bridge travelers might ask themselves. I quote, "On a sunny day in spring, when the wind whips up the whitecaps and the light glistens on the water, the view from the Newport Bridge stuns me into musing. Do I ever take this ride and these sights for granted?" It is the view and sentiment Governor Chafee was hoping for when he insisted that the designers make certain travelers could see the beauty of Narragansett Bay as they crossed over its east passage. The article is a beautifully written homage to the bridge and the region. The locals have an expression to describe certain experiences and rituals particular to the state. They call it the full Rhode Island. Watson and Rodriguez have provided us with the full Newport Bridge. It was the proponent's perseverance that Governor Leach, referring to his speech during the Newport Bridge's opening ceremony. And the two men responsible for the bridge were John Chafee and Joe Dwyer, both members of the Greatest Generation. These were the men and women who were born and raised during World War II and the Great Depression. They developed values that served them and their country well, including personal responsibility, duty, honor, and faith. No job was too big, no number of jobs too many. In 1965, as controversies about the bridge escalated, the state of Rhode Island, under Governor Chafee's leadership, purchased Coal State Park in Bristol. The state later dedicated a statue to Chafee overlooking the park's fishing pier. It captures Chafee in full purposeful stride. His inspiring words are etched into the statue's base. What we do today, we do for our children and our children's children. You cannot see the Newport Bridge from this vantage point. Rather than keep an eye on the bridge, Chafee is marching away from Newport, up the bay towards Providence. Rhode Islanders owe Chafee and Dwyer gratitude for their role in building the Newport Bridge, which helped breathe life into Newport as it transformed itself from a sailor town and resurrected its economy on a foundation of tourism in the decades following World War II. It is unlikely the bridge would have been built when and where it was without them. The bridge itself is a fitting monument to their perseverance. Thank you. I can take some questions. Yes, sir.
With the Bridge, the San Francisco, the Touro Bridge, walking path, did they ever consider that?
Not that I saw. Now, of course, you can walk over it once a year in October, right? They have a bridge. So, I have not seen any evidence to that. Yes, sir.
Could you comment on the being shipped? I know there must have been a concern that the development need would have to have, let's say, the super shipped. Do you have any sort of comments on how the Navy?
Well, the Navy, first of all, they didn't want to bridge it. Yeah, they didn't want to bridge it all, right, first. And then when they did, they specified that it be a certain height and the span a certain width. Now, yes, for ships, but they weren't the only ones. The maritime maritime companies that were used the bay for shipping also opined on the length that it needed to be. The Navy was also concerned that it could become a target and be blown up and block their operations in the Navy, which were very, very extensive. I mean, there's the list of operations in and around Narragansett Bay. It's shocking that the Navy would have here. So I don't know about the sizes of the bridges down the road. The Navy really moved out of Newport as its home port in '73 and down to Virginia. So I don't think they ever got to the biggest boats would have been those Essex size aircraft carriers, and that's what they were dealing with at that time. Yes, sir.
I'm going to plead naivety on this one. It's always surprised me, without knowing much of the history of the Jamestown Bridge myself, that the bridge to Jamestown was built from essentially the west side of the bay to Jamestown, rather than from the more populated Newport side to Jamestown. And there was no I-95 when that bridge was conceived. I assume the bridge was to try to get the population of Jamestown to and from, there was a ferry system running on the east side of the passage. But back then, was there the talk of a bridge connecting Jamestown to Newport in the early days of the Jamestown Bridge conception?
In 1935, when the bridges were being contemplated, they envisioned a total crossing. The Jamestown Bridge did not get built until 1940, so right as World War II, and there was war planning going on, 38 probably. So there was, so they did not build the Newport Bridge part from Jamestown to Newport because of World War II. So the Jamestown Bridge really was a bridge to nowhere, and that's what it's been called, a bridge to nowhere. Sue Madden has a book on it, if you're ever interested in reading about the Jamestown Bridge. So people rushed over the bridge and waited at the Newport Ferry. They could go see Beauty Tale, I guess, if they had a few minutes. Yes, sir.
With the tolls, is the bridge self-sustaining today?
Yes. Yeah. I've really not done much to, with all the construction that's needed, I'm not sure how that's going to pay for. But over 10 million people a day go over the bridge.
A year.
A year. 10 million a day. That's what it feels like. Yes, sir.
You know why there's all those little square holes in the bridge there?
Yes, I actually, no, that's part of the design. You mean the square, like on the curb, at the curb section?
All the repairs.
Oh, no, I don't know. I do know why those curb cuts are there, where you'll see them like, in the curb, and that is to help the stability of the bridge. Bridges get their stability from the truss work that holds up the roadway, and other aerodynamic aspects of it. So they actually made those cuts. I don't know what the ones are now.
Yes, sir. Two questions. The first one is there any indication as to whether the pilings that were installed there in 1965 to 1969, how long they will be able to withstand the ebb and flow of the tides there, and the additional weight that's now on there as a result of the concrete dividers that have been added in recent years because of accident prevention, and the number of cars going over it in terms of the innate stability of the structure. Any idea about that?
I can only tell you what the bridge engineers said, that a maintained bridge will last forever. Right? The piers for the bridge, I mentioned the riprap. The riprap was there to prevent scouring of the piers. And scouring occurs because of the flow, the rapid flow underneath the bridge. So that there is 3 cylinders, if you will, like bowling ball, 1 and 2 and 3, that are there to prevent the effects of that scouring to wear down the bridge. I do know the bridge engineer who did the median, the Jersey divider, and they maintain that it's well suited for it.
One other question, I don't know whether you would know the answer, but I understand that there is some unique security to the bridge, surveillance, because of the Navy's presence there. Can you?
And not uncovered that at all.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yes, sir.
Just can you review the elevations to the 400 foot on the east? What's the surface of the soil?
Oh, sure.
You mean you start at one level that you have, how deep is the water, and then you begin to...
Yes, it's 400, on one side of the bridge, it goes down like 430.
To bedrock.
To bedrock. But there's silt and other, it's in clay types, The fill over time.
Is that 200 feet of fill?
Yes, and one side, yes, on one side. And on 100, and on the Jamestown side, 150 feet. It's not that deep.
So how would they drive the pile? Would they add section upon section to get down?
Yes. Yeah.
All that from the surface?
From the surface. Must have been noisy. Yes, ma'am.
When did the name change to the Pell Bridge?
92.
And the significance was, I mean, was that hard to do? Was it consensus?
It was not hard to do. It was done by the Rhode Island legislature to honor Senator Pell. Senator Governor Chafee, Senator Chafee, has always said it was a craw in his throat that the bridge was named after instead of him. And then he said, but no one ever calls it the Pell Bridge anyway. One more question?
Was the color choice much of a hotly debated issue?
No, not really. But the silver and green was the original colors. So it was. There was not much talk about it. Didn't find much information about it. The Golden Gate Bridge, the International Orange, was discussed quite a bit before they went to that. Yes, one.
Can you tell us more about? I'm sure you did mention the interior paint job that was done on it.
Yes.
Many years ago.
I didn't cover it in this talk, but the paint job was another innovation by Bethlehem Steel. It was a tri-part paint, acrylic paint, that was applied partially there and partially here once the bridge was put up. You can see some of the pictures show the rest here. It began flaking almost immediately. So the bridge opened in June, June 28, 1969. It began flaking, I think, October of 70. So almost immediately. And the lawsuits began almost immediately as to who was at fault. So it took 10 years before that was fully decided by 3 Rhode Island Supreme Court decisions, who said that Bethlehem Steel did not properly clean the mill spores from the steel, and that's what caused the bridge to flake immediately. Yes?
How much was the bridge awarded from Bethlehem Steel for that lawsuit? Do you know the amount of money they got?
It was $6.8 million. It varied. Read each. You have to really dig into those Supreme Court cases. But when you think, it's like they ultimately ended up paying 6.8, around 6.8 million.
Which would have paid for the bridge?
No, the bridge was 60 million, but it would have paid for the paint job.
We'll stop there, because I think we probably could keep Jim here all night asking questions. So I think thank you very much. There's a lot of the book that, so